Shepherd, China Shepherd, Chyna. Ah, not a cryptic chant after all. What? Odd name. Is it? Don't spar with me, China. Go on. Alright, but first may I have something to drink? I'm dehydrated. At the sink, he drew a glass of water. He put 3 ice cubes in it. He started to bring it to her, then halted and said, I could add a slice of lemon. She knew he wasn't joking. Home from the hunt, he was working now to recast himself from the role of savage stalker into that of accountant or clerk or real estate agent or a car mechanic or whatever it was that he did when he was passing for normal. Some sociopaths could put on a false persona that was more convincing than the best performances of the finest actors who had ever lived, and this man was probably one of those, although after immersion in wanton slaughter, he needed this period of adjustment to remind himself of the manners and courtesies of civilized society. No thanks, she said to the offer of lemon. It's no trouble, he graciously assured her. Just the water. When he put the glass down, he slipped a cork-lined ceramic coaster under it. Then he sat across the table from her again. China was repelled by the prospect of drinking from a glass that he had handled, but she really was dehydrated. Her mouth was dry, and her throat was vaguely sore. Because of the cuffs, she picked up the glass in both hands. She knew that he was watching her for signs of fear. The water didn't slop around in the tumbler. The rim of the glass didn't chatter against her teeth. She truly wasn't afraid of him anymore, at least not for the moment, although maybe later, certainly later. Now her interior landscape was a desert under sullen skies, numbing desolation with the angry flicker of lightning toward a far horizon. She drank half of the water before she put the glass down. When I entered the room a moment ago, the killer said, you were sitting with your hands folded, your head bowed against your hands. Were you praying? She thought about it. No. There's no point in lying to me. I'm not lying. I wasn't praying just then. But you do pray? Sometimes. God fears me. She waited. He said, God fears me. Those are words that can be made from the letters of my name. I see. Dragon seed. From the letters of your name, she said. Yes, and Forge of Rage. It's an interesting game. Names are interesting. Yours is passive. A place name for a first name. And Shepherd, bucolic, fuzzily Christian. When I think of your name, I see an Asian peasant on a hillside with sheep, or a slant-eyed Christ making converts among the heathens. He smiled, amused by his banter. But clearly, your name doesn't define you well. You're not a passive person. I have been, she said, most of my life. Really? Well, you weren't passive last night. Not last night, she agreed, but until then. My name, on the other hand, is a power name. Edgeler Foreman Vess. He spelled it for her. Not Edgar. Edgeler, like on the edge. And Vess, if you draw it out, it's like a serpent hissing. Demon. Yes, that's right. It's there in my name. Demon. Anger. He seemed pleased by her willingness to play. You're good at this, especially considering that you don't have pen and paper. Vessel, she said, that's in your name too. An easy one, but also semen. Vessel and semen, female and male. Would you like to craft an insult out of that, China? Instead of replying, she picked up the glass and drank half of the remaining water. The ice cubes were cold against her teeth. Now that you've wet your whistle, Vess said, I want to know all about you. Remember, Scrimshaw. China told him everything, beginning with the moment that she had heard a scream while sitting at the guest bedroom window in the Templeton house. She delivered her account in a monotone, not by calculation, but because suddenly she could speak no other way. She tried to vary her inflection, put life into her words, but failed. The sound of her voice droning through the events of the night scared her as Edgeler Vess no longer did. Her account came to her as if she were listening to someone else speak, and it was the voice of a lost and defeated person. She told herself that she was not defeated, that she still had hope, that she would get the best of this murderous bastard one way or another, but her inner voice lacked all conviction. In spite of China's spiritless recitation of events, Vess was a rapt listener. He began in a relaxed slouch, lounging back in his chair, but by the time China finished, he was leaning forward with his arms on the table, hunched toward her. He interrupted her several times to ask questions. At the end, he sat for a while in contemplative silence. She could not bear to look at him. She folded her hands on the table, closed her eyes, and put her forehead against the backs of her church door thumbs, as she had been when Vess had come out of the laundry room. She wasn't praying this time either. She lacked the hope needed for prayer. After a few minutes, she heard Vess's chair slide back from the table. He got up. She heard him moving around, and then the familiar clatter of any cook being busy in the kitchen. She smelled butter heating in a pan, then browning onions. In the telling of her story, China had lost her appetite, and it didn't return with the aroma of the onions. Finally, Vess said, "Funny that I didn't smell you right away at the Templetons." "You can do that?" she asked, without raising her head from her hands. "You can just smell people out as if you were a damn dog?" "Usually," he said, taking no offense, and with what seemed to be utmost seriousness. "And you must have made a sound more than once through the night. You surely can't be that stealthy. Even your breathing I should have heard." Then came the sound of a wire whisk vigorously beating eggs in a bowl. She smelled bread toasting. In a still house with everyone dead, your movements should have made currents in the air, like a cool breath on the back of my neck, shivering the fine hairs on my hands. Your every movement should have been a different texture against my eyes. And when I walked through a space where you'd just been, I should have sensed the displacement of air caused by your passage. He was stone crazy. So cute in his chambray shirt with his beautiful blue eyes, his thick dark hair combed straight back from his forehead and the dimple in his left cheek, but pustulant and canker-riddled inside. My senses, you see, are unusually acute. He ran the water in the sink. Without looking, she knew that he was rinsing the whisk. He wouldn't put it aside dirty. He said, "My senses are so sharp because I've given myself to sensation. Sensation is my religion, you might say." A sizzling arose, much louder than the cooking sound of onions, and a new aroma. "But you were invisible to me," he said, "like a spirit. What makes you special?" "Bitter," she murmured against the tabletop. "If I was special, would I be here in chains?" Although China hadn't actually spoken to him, and wouldn't have thought that he could hear her above the crisp sputtering of eggs and onions, Vess said, "I suppose you're right." Later, when he put the plates on the table, she raised her head and moved her hands. "Rather than make you eat with your hands, I'm going to give you a fork," he said, "because I assume you see the pointlessness of throwing it and trying to stick me in the eye." She nodded. "Good girl." On her plate was a plump 4-egg omelet, oozing cheddar cheese and stippled with sautéed onions. On top were 3 slices of a firm tomato and a sprinkling of chopped parsley. 2 pieces of buttered toast, each neatly sliced in the diagonal, were arranged to bracket the omelet. He refilled her water glass and added 2 more cubes of ice. Famished only a short while ago, China now could hardly tolerate the sight of food. She knew that she must eat, so she picked at the eggs and nibbled the toast, but she would never be able to finish all that he had given her. Vess ate with gusto, but not noisily or sloppily. His table manners were beyond reproach, and he used his napkin frequently to blot his lips. China was deep in her private grayness, and the more Vess appeared to enjoy his breakfast, the more her own omelet began to taste like ashes. "You'd be quite attractive if you weren't so rumpled and sweaty, your face smudged with dirt, your hair straggly from the rain. Very attractive, I think. A real charmer under that grime. Maybe later I'll bathe you." China Shepherd, untouched and alive. Uncannily, after a further silence, Edgeler Vess said, "Untouched and alive." She knew that she had not spoken the prayer aloud. Untouched and alive, he repeated. Is that what you said on the stairs earlier, on your way down to Ariel? She stared at him, speechless. Is it? Finally, yes. I've been wondering about it. You said your name and then those 3 words, though none of it made sense when I didn't know that China Shepherd was your name. She looked away from him at the window. A Doberman roamed the backyard. Was it a prayer? He asked. In her desolation, China hadn't thought that he could scare her anymore, but she had been wrong. His intuitiveness was frightening, and not entirely for reasons that she could understand. She looked away from the Doberman and met Vess's eyes. For one brief moment, she saw the dog within, a dark and merciless aspect. Was it a prayer? He asked again. Yes. In your heart, China, deep in your heart, do you truly believe that God really exists? Be truthful now, not just with me, but with yourself. At one time, not long ago, she had been just barely sure enough of what she believed to answer yes. Now she was silent. Even if God exists, Vess said, does he know that you do? She took another bite of the omelet. It seemed greasier than before. The eggs and butter and cheese, too rich, cloyed in her mouth and she could hardly swallow. She put down her fork. She was finished. She'd eaten no more than a third of her meal. Vess finished the food on his plate, washing it down with coffee that he didn't offer her, no doubt because he thought that she would try to throw the hot brew in his eyes. You look so glum, Vess said. She didn't reply. You're feeling like such a failure, aren't you? You failed poor Ariel, yourself, and God too, if he exists. What do you want with me? She asked. She meant, why put me through this? Why not kill me and get it over with? I haven't figured that out yet, Vess said. Whatever I do with you, it's got to be special. I feel you're special whether you think you are or not, and whatever we do together should be intense. She closed her eyes and wondered if she could find Narnia again after all these years. He said, I can't answer your question as to what I want with you, but I have no doubts about what I want with Ariel. Would you like to hear what I intend to do with her? Most likely she was too old to believe in anything, even just a magic wardrobe. Vess's voice came out of her internal grayness, as if he lived there as well as in the real world. I asked you a question, China. Remember our bargain. You can either answer it, or else slice off a piece of your face. Would you like to hear what I intend to do with Ariel? I'm sure I know. Yes, some of it. Sex, that's obvious. She's a luscious piece. I haven't touched her yet, but I will. And I believe she's a virgin, at least in the days when she still talked. She said she was, and she didn't seem like the kind of girl who would lie. Or there was the wild wood beyond the river, Ratty and Mole and Mr. Badger, green boughs hanging full in the summer sun, and Pan piping in the cool shadows under the trees. And I want to hear her crying, lost and crying. I want to smell the purity of her tears. I want to feel the exquisite texture of her screams, know the clean smell of them, and the taste of her terror. There's always that, always that. Neither the languid river nor the wild wood materialized, though China strained to see them. Ratty, Mole, Mr. Badger, and Mr. Toad were gone forever into the hateful death that claims all things. And the sadness of this, in its way, was as great as the sadness of what had happened to Laura and what would soon happen to China herself. Vess said, once in a while I bring one of them back to the room in the cellar, and always for the same purpose. She didn't want to hear this. The handcuffs made it difficult to cover her ears, and if she had tried, he would have shackled her wrists to her ankles. He would insist that she listen. The most intense experiences of my life have all taken place in that room, China. Not the sex, not the beating, or the cutting. That all comes later. And it's a lagniappe, Lagniapp. First I break them down, and that is when it gets intense. Her chest was tight. She could breathe only shallowly. He said, the first day or two they all think they'll go out of their minds with fear, but they're wrong. It takes longer than a day or two to drive someone insane, truly and irrevocably insane. Ariel is my 7th captive, and the others all held on to their sanity for weeks. One of them cracked on the 18th day, but 3 of them lasted a full 2 months. China gave up on the elusive Wildwood and met his gaze across the table. Psychological torture is so much more interesting and difficult to undertake than the physical variety, although the latter can be undeniably thrilling, Beth said. The mind is so much tougher than the body, a greater challenge by far. And when the mind goes, I swear I can hear the crack, a harder sound than bone splitting, and oh, how it reverberates. She tried to see the animal consciousness in his eyes, which she had glimpsed unexpectedly before. She needed to see it. When they crack, some of them writhe on the floor, thrash, rend their clothes. They tear at their hair, China, and claw their faces, and some of them bite themselves hard enough to draw blood. They maim themselves in so many inventive ways. They sob and sob, can't stop for hours, sometimes for days, sobbing in their sleep. They bark like dogs, China, and screech and flail their arms as if they're convinced that they can fly. They hallucinate and see things more frightening than I am to them. Some speak in tongues. It's called glossolalia. Do you know the condition? Quite fascinating. Convincingly like a language, yet meaningless, a ranting or pleading babble. Some lose control of their bodily functions and wallow in their filth. Messy but riveting to watch. The true base condition of humanity, to which most people can only admit in madness. As hard as she tried, China could see no beast in his eyes, only a placid blueness and the watchful darkness of the pupil, and she was no longer sure that she had ever seen it. He wasn't half man and half wolf, not a creature that fell to all fours in the light of the full moon. Worse, he was nothing but a man, living at one extreme end of the spectrum of human cruelty, but nonetheless only a man. Some take refuge in catatonic silences, Vess continued, as Ariel has done. But I always break them out of that. Ariel is by far the most stubborn, but that only makes her interesting. I'll break her too. When her crack comes, China, it'll be like no other. Glorious, intense. The most intense experience of all is showing mercy, China said, and had no idea whatsoever where she had found those words. They sounded like a plea, and she didn't want him to think that she was begging for her life. Even in her despair, she would not be reduced to groveling. A sudden smile made Vess look almost like a boy, one given to puns and pranks. Collector of baseball cards, rider of bikes, builder of model airplanes, and altar boy on Sundays. She thought that he was smiling at what she'd said and amused by her naivety, but this was not the case, as he had made clear with his next words. Maybe what I want from you, Vess said, is to be with me when I finally make Ariel snap. Instead of killing you in front of her to drive her over the edge, I'll drive her some other way, and you can watch. Oh, gosh. You're a psychology student after all, almost a genuine master of psychology, right? Sitting there in such stern judgment of me, so certain that my mind is aberrant and that you know exactly how I think. Well, then, how interesting it would be to see if any of the modern theories of the working of the mind are undone by this little experiment. Don't you think so? After I break Ariel, you could write a paper about it, China, for my eyes only. I'd enjoy reading your considered observations. Dear goodness, it would never come to that. She'd never be a witness to such a thing. Though in shackles, she would find a way to commit suicide before she would let him take her down to that room to watch that lovely girl, to watch her dissolve. China would bite open her own wrists, swallow her tongue, contrive to fall down the steps and break her neck. Something. Evidently aware that he had jolted her out of great despair into stark horror, Beth smiled again, and then turned his attention to her breakfast plate. Do you intend to eat the rest of that? No. Then I'll have it. He slid his empty plate aside and pulled hers in front of him. Using her fork, he cut a bite-sized piece of the cold omelet and put it in his mouth and moaned softly in delight. Slowly, sensuously, Vess extracted the tines from his mouth, pressing his lips firmly around them as they slid loose, then reaching with his tongue for one last lick. After he swallowed the bite of eggs, he said, I could taste you on the fork. Your saliva has a lovely flavor, except for a faint bitterness. No doubt that's not a usual component, just the result of a sour stomach. She could find no escape by closing her eyes, so she watched as he devoured the remains of her breakfast. When he finished, she had a question of her own. Last night, why did you eat the spider? Why not? That's no answer. It's the best answer to any question. And give me second best. You think it was disgusting? I'm just curious. No doubt you see it as a negative experience, eating an icky, squirmy spider. No doubt. But there are no negative experiences, China, only sensations. No values can be attached to pure sensation. Of course they can. If you think so, then you're in the wrong century. Anyway, the spider had an interesting flavor, and now I understand spiders better for having absorbed one. Do you know about flatworm learning? Flatworm? You should have encountered it in a basic biology course along the way to becoming such a highly educated woman. You see, certain flatworms can gradually learn to negotiate a maze. She did remember and interrupted. Then, if you grind them up and feed them to another batch of flatworms, batch number 2 can run the same maze on the first try. Good. Yes, Vess nodded happily. They absorbed the knowledge with the flesh. She didn't need to consider how to phrase her next question, for Vess could be neither insulted nor flattered. You don't actually believe you now know what it's like to be a spider, have all the knowledge of a spider because you've eaten one? Of course not, China. If I were that literal-minded, I'd be crazy, wouldn't I? In an institution somewhere, talking to a crowd of imaginary friends. But because of my sharp senses, I did absorb from the spider an ineffable quality of spiderness that you'll never be able to understand. I heightened my awareness of the spider as a marvelously engineered little hunter, a creature of power. Spider is a power word, you know, though it can't be formed from the letters of my name. He hesitated, pondering, and then continued. It can be formed from the letters of your name. She didn't bother to remind him about her mother's precious spelling. Only spider, S-P-Y-D-E-R, could be found in China Shepherd. And it was risky eating a spider, which added considerably to the appeal, Vess continued. Unless you're an entomologist, you can't be sure if any particular specimen is poisonous or not. Some, like the brown recluse, are extremely dangerous. A bite on the hand is one thing, but I had to be sure that I was quick and crushed it against the roof of my mouth before it could bite my tongue. You like taking risks? He shrugged. I'm just that kind of guy. On edge. Words in my name, he acknowledged. And if you'd been bitten on the tongue? Pain is the same as pleasure, just different. Learn to enjoy it and you're happier with life. Even pain is value neutral? Sure, just sensation. It helps grow the reef of the soul, if there is a soul. She didn't know what the hell he was talking about, the reef of the soul, and she didn't ask. She was wary of him, weary of fearing him, even weary of hating him. With her question, she was striving to understand, as she had striven all her life, and she was tired to death of searching for meaning. She would never know why some people committed countless little cruelties or bigger ones, and the struggle to understand had only exhausted her and left her empty, cold, and gray inside. Pointing to her red and swollen index finger, Vess said, "That must hurt, and your neck." "The headache's the worst of it, and none of it's anything like pleasure." "Well, I can easily show you the way to enlightenment and prove you're wrong. It takes time. But there's a smaller lesson, quick to learn." He got it from his chair and went to a spice rack at the end of the kitchen cabinets. Among the small bottles and tins of thyme, cloves, dill, nutmeg, chili pepper, ginger, marjoram, and cinnamon was a bottle of aspirin. "I don't take this for headaches because I like to savor the pain, but I keep aspirin on hand because once in a while I like to chew on them for the taste. They're vile. Just bitter. Bitterness can be as pleasing as sweetness. When you learn that every experience, every sensation is worthwhile." He returned to the table with the bottle of aspirin. He put it in front of her and took away her glass of water. "No thanks," she said. "Bitterness has its place." She ignored the bottle. "Suit yourself," Vess said, clearing the plates off the table. Although China needed relief from her various pains, she refused to touch the aspirin. Perhaps irrationally, but nonetheless strongly, she felt that by chewing a few of the tablets, even strictly for the medicinal effect, she would be stepping into the strange rooms of Edgeler Vess's madness. This was a threshold that she didn't care to cross for any purpose, even with one foot solidly anchored in the real world. He hand-washed the breakfast plates, bowls, pans, and utensils. He was efficient and fastidious, using steaming hot water and lots of lemon-scented dishwashing liquid. China had one more question that could not go unasked, and at last she said, "Why the Templetons? Why choose them of all people? It wasn't random, was it? Not just the place you happened to stop in the night?" "Not just random," he agreed, scrubbing the omelet pan with a plastic scouring pad. "A few weeks back, Paul Templeton was up this way on business, and when—" "You knew him?" "Not really. He was in town, the county seat, on business, like I said, and as he was taking something from his wallet to show me, a set of those little hinged plastic windows fell out, with little wallet-sized photographs, and I picked them up for him. One of the pictures was his wife, another was Laura. She looked so fresh, unspoiled. I said something like, 'That's a pretty girl,' and Paul was off and running about her, every inch the proud papa. Told me she was soon going to have her master's degree in psychology, 3.8 grade average and everything. He told me how he really missed her away at school even after 6 years of getting used to it, and how he couldn't wait for the end of the month because Laura was coming home for a 3-day weekend. He didn't mention she was bringing along a friend. An accident, photos dropped, a casual exchange, mere idle conversation. The arbitrariness of it was breathtaking, and almost more than China could bear. Then, as she watched Vess thoroughly wiping off the counters and rinsing the dishpan and scrubbing the sink, China began to feel that what had happened to the Templeton family was worse than merely arbitrary. All this violent death began to seem fated, an inexorable spiral into lasting darkness, as if they had been born and had lived only for Edgeler Vess. It was as if she too had been born and had struggled this far only for the purpose of bringing one moment of sick satisfaction to this soulless predator. The worst horror of his rampages was not the pain and fear that he inflicted, not the blood, not the mutilated cadavers. The pain and the fear were comparatively brief, considering all the routine pain and anxiety of life. The blood and bodies were merely aftermath. The worst horror was that he stole meaning from the unfinished lives of those people he killed, made himself the primary purpose of their existence, robbed them not of time, but of fulfillment. His base sins were envy of beauty, of happiness, and pride, bending the whole world to his view of creation, and these were the greatest sins of all, the same transgressions over which the devil himself, once an archangel, had stumbled and fallen a long way out of heaven. Hand-drying the plates, pans, and flatware in the drainage rack, returning each piece to the proper shelf or drawer, Edgeler Vess looked as pink-clean as a freshly bathed baby and as innocent as the stillborn. He smelled of soap, a good bracing aftershave, and lemon-scented dishwashing liquid. But in spite of all this, China found herself superstitiously expecting to detect a whiff of brimstone. Every life led to a series of quiet epiphanies, or at least to opportunities for epiphanies, and China was washed by a poignant new grief when she thought about this grim aspect of the Templeton family's interrupted journeys. The kindness they might have done for others, the love they might have given, the things they might have come to understand in their hearts. Vess finished the breakfast cleanup and returned to the table. "I have a few things to do, upstairs, outside, and then I'll have to sleep 4 or 5 hours if I can. I've got to go to work this evening. I need my rest." She wondered what work he did, but she didn't ask. He might be talking about a job, or about his dogged assault on Ariel's sanity. If the latter, China didn't want to know what was coming. When you shift around in the chair, do it easy. Those chains will scrape the wood if you're not careful. I'd hate to mar the furniture, she said. He stared at her for perhaps half a minute and then said, If you're stupid enough to think you can get free, I'll hear the chains rattling, and I'll have to come back in here to quiet you. If that's necessary, you won't like what I'll do. She said nothing. She was hopelessly hobbled and chained down. She couldn't possibly escape. Even if you somehow get free of the table and chairs, you can't move fast, and attack dogs patrol the grounds. I've seen them, she assured him. If you weren't chained, they'd still drag you down and kill you before you'd gone 10 steps from the door. She believed him, but she didn't understand why he felt the need to press the point so hard. I once turned a young man loose in the yard, Vess said. He raced straight to the nearest tree and got up and out of harm's way with only one bad bite in his right calf and a nip on the left ankle. He braced himself in the branches and thought he would be safe for a little while, with the dog circling below and watching him. But I got a .22 rifle and went out on the back porch and shot him in the leg from there. He fell out of the tree, and then it was all over in maybe a minute. China said nothing. There were moments when communicating with this hateful thing seemed no more possible than discussing the merits of Mozart with a shark. This was one of those moments. You were invisible to me last night, he said. She waited. His gaze traveled over her, and he seemed to be looking for a loose link in one of the chains, or a handcuff left open and unnoticed until now. Like a spirit. She was not sure that it was ever possible to discern what this thing was thinking, but right now, goodness, it seemed to be vaguely uneasy about leaving her alone. She couldn't for the life of her imagine why. Stay, he said. She nodded. Good girl. He went to the door between the kitchen and the living room. Realizing they had one more issue to discuss, she said, Before you go. He turned to look at her. Could you take me to a bathroom? She asked. It's too much trouble to undo the chains just now, he said. Piss in your pants if you have to. I'm going to clean you up later anyway, and I can buy new chair cushions. He pushed through the door into the living room and was gone. China was determined not to endure the humiliation of sitting in her own waste. She had a faint urge to pee, but it wasn't insistent yet. Later, she would be in trouble. How odd that she could still care about avoiding humiliation or think about the future. Halfway across the living room, Mr. Vess stops to listen to the woman in the kitchen. He hears no clink of chains. He waits, and still no sound. The silence troubles him. He's not sure what to make of her. He knows so much about her now, and yet she still contains mysteries. Shackled and in his complete control, surely she cannot be his blown tire. She smells of despair and defeat. In the beaten tone of her voice, he sees the gray of ashes and feels the texture of a coffin blanket. She's as good as dead, and she is resigned to it yet. From the kitchen comes the clink of chains, not loud, not a vigorous assault on her bonds, just a quiet rattle as she shifts position, perhaps to clasp her thighs tightly together to repress the urge to urinate. Mr. Vess smiles. He goes upstairs to his room. From the top shelf at the back of his walk-in closet, he takes down a telephone. In the bedroom, he plugs it into a wall jack and makes 2 calls, letting people know that he has returned from his 3-day vacation and will be back in harness by this evening. Although he is confident that the Dobermans, in his absence, will never allow anyone to get into the house, Vess keeps only 2 phones and secretes them in closets when he is not at home. In the extremely unlikely event that an intruder should manage to sprint through the attacking dogs and get into the house alive, he will not be able to call for help. The danger of cellular phones has been on Mr. Vess's mind in recent days. It's difficult to imagine a would-be burglar carrying a portable phone, or using it to call the police for help from a house in which he's become trapped by guard dogs. But stranger things have happened. If China Shepherd had found a cellular phone in the clerk's Honda the previous night, she would not be the one now languishing in shackles. The technological revolution here at the end of the millennium offers numerous conveniences and great opportunities, but it also has dangerous aspects. Thanks to his expertise with computers, he has cleverly altered his fingerprint files with various agencies and can go without gloves at places like the Templeton House, enjoying the full sensuality of the experience without fear. But one cellular phone in the wrong hands at the wrong time could lead suddenly to the most intense experience of his life. And the final one. He sometimes longs for the simpler age of Jack the Ripper or the splendid Ed Gein, who inspired Psycho, or Richard Speck. He dreams wistfully of the less complicated world of earlier decades and of killing fields that were less trampled than by such as he. By feverishly pursuing high ratings, by hyping every story steeped in blood, by making celebrities out of killers, and by fawning over celebrity killers, the electronic news media happily may have inspired more of his clear-thinking kind, but they have also alarmed the sheep too much. Too many in the herd are wall-eyed with alertness and quick to run at the first perception of danger. Still, he manages to have his fun. After making his calls, Mr. Vest goes out to the motorhome. The license plates, the blunt end screws, and the nuts to attach them to the vehicle, and a screwdriver are in a drawer in the kitchenette. By various means, usually 2 or 3 weeks prior to one of his expeditions, Mr. Vest carefully selects his primary targets like the Templeton family. And though he sometimes brings back a living prize for the cellar room, he nearly always travels well beyond the borders of Oregon to minimize the chances that his 2 lives, good citizen and homicidal adventurer, will cross at the most inconvenient moment. Parentheses, though he didn't employ this method to get Laura Templeton, he has found that clandestine browsing via computer through the huge Department of Motor Vehicles records in neighboring California is an excellent method of locating attractive women. Their driver's license photographs, headshots only, are now on file with the DMV. Provided with each picture are the woman's age, height, and weight. Statistics that assist Vest in identifying unacceptable candidates so he can avoid grandmothers who photograph well and plump women with thin faces. And though some people list post office boxes only, most use their street addresses. Thereafter, Mr. Vest needs only a series of good maps. Close parentheses. Upon nearing the end of his drive, when he gets within 50 miles of the target residence, he removes the license plates from the motorhome. Later, because he makes a point of being far away from the scene of his games by the time anyone finds the aftermath, he could be tracked down only if someone in the victim's neighborhood happened to see the motorhome and, though it looked perfectly innocent, happened to glance at the plates and that damn blown tire again, happened to have a photographic memory. Therefore, he leaves the tags off his vehicle until he is safely back in Oregon. If he were stopped by a police officer for speeding or for some other traffic violation, he would express surprise when asked about his missing license plates and would say that for who knows what reason they must have been stolen. He is a good actor. He could sell his bafflement. If the chance arose to do so without putting himself in serious jeopardy, he would kill the cop. And if no such opportunity presented itself, he would most likely be able to count on a swift resolution of the problem by calling upon professional courtesy. Now he squats on his haunches and attaches one of the tags to the frame in the front license plate niche. One by one the dogs come to him, sniffing at his hands and his clothes, perhaps disappointed to find only the scents of aftershave and dishwashing soap. They are starved for attention, but they are on duty. None of them lingers long, each returning to its patrol after one pat on the head and a scratch behind the ears and a word of affection. Good dog, Mr. Vest says to each, good dog. When he finishes with the front plate, he stands, stretches, and yawns while surveying his domain. At ground level anyway, the wind has died. The air is still and moist. Smells of wet grass, earth, moldering dead leaves, and pine forests. With the rain finished, the mist is lifting off the foothills and off the lower flanks of the mountains behind the house. He can't see the peaks of the western range yet, or even the blanket of snow lingering on the higher slopes. But directly overhead and to the east, where the mist doesn't intervene, the clouds are more gray than thunderhead black, a soft moleskin gray. And they are moving rapidly southeast in front of a high-altitude wind. By midnight, as he promised Ariel, there might be stars and even a moon to light the tall grass in the meadow and to shine in the milky eyes of the dead Laura. Mr. Vest goes to the back of the motorhome to attach the second license plate and discovers odd tracks on the driveway. As he stands staring at them, a frown pools and deepens on his face. The driveway is shale, but during a heavy rain, mud washes out from the surrounding yard. Here and there it forms a thin skin atop the stone, not soupy, but dark and dense. In the skin of mud are hoof impressions, perhaps those of a deer, the size of a deer. It has crossed the driveway more than once. He sees the place where it stood for a while, pawing the ground. No tire tracks mar the mud because they were erased by the rain that had been falling when he'd come home. Evidently, the deer spoor date from after the storm. He crouches beside the tracks and puts his fingers to the cold mud. He can feel the hardness and smoothness of the hooves that stamp the marks. A variety of deer thrive in the nearby foothills and mountains. They rarely venture onto Mr. Vest's property, however, because they are frightened of the Dobermans. This is the most peculiar thing about the deer tracks. He crouches beside the tracks and puts his fingers to the cold mud. He can feel the hardness and smoothness of the hooves that stamp the marks. A variety of deer thrive in the nearby foothills and mountains. They rarely venture onto Mr. Vest's property, however, because they are frightened of the Dobermans. This is the most peculiar thing about the deer tracks, that among them are no paw prints from the dogs. The Dobermans have been trained to focus on human intruders and, as much as possible, to ignore wildlife. Otherwise, they might be distracted at a moment crucial to their master's safety. They will never attack rabbits, or squirrels, or possums, or deer, unless severe hunger eventually drives them to it. They won't even give playful chase. Nevertheless, the dogs will take notice of other animals that cross their paths. They indulge their curiosity within the limits of their training. They would have approached this deer and circled ever closer as it stood here, either paralyzing it with fright or spooking it off. And after it had gone, they would have padded back and forth across the driveway, sniffing at the spoor. But not one paw print is visible among the hoof impressions. Rubbing his muddy fingertips together, Mr. Vest rises to his full height and slowly turns in a circle, studying the surrounding land. The meadows to the north and the distant piney woods beyond, the driveway leading east to the bald knoll, the yard to the south, more meadows beyond, and the woods again. Finally, the backyard, past the barn to the foothills. The deer, if it was a deer, is gone. Edgeley Vest stands motionless, listening, watchful, breathing deeply, seeking scents, and for a while he inhales through his open mouth, catching what he can upon his tongue. He feels the moist air like the clammy skin of a cadaver against his face. All his senses are open wide, iris to the max, and the freshly washed world drains into them. Finally, he can detect no harm in the morning. As Vest is putting the license plate on the back of the motorhome, Tilsiter pads to him. The dog nuzzles his master's neck. Vest encourages the Doberman to stay. When he has finished with the plate, he points Tilsiter to the nearby deer spoor. The dog seems not to see the tracks, or seeing them, he does not have any interest. Vest leads him to the spoor, right in among the prints. Once more he points to them. Because Tilsiter appears to be confused, Vest places his hand on the back of the dog's head and presses his muzzle into one of the tracks. The Doberman catches the scent at last, sniffs eagerly, whimpers with excitement, and decides that he doesn't like what he smells. He squirms out from under his master's hand and backs off, looking sheepish. "What?" says Bess. The dog licks his chops. He looks away from Bess, surveys the meadow, the lane, the yard. He glances at Bess again, but then he trots off to the south, returning to patrol. The trees still dripping, the mists rising, the spent clouds scudding fast toward the southeast. Mr. Bess decides to kill China Shepherd immediately. He will haul her into the yard, make her lie face down on the grass, and put a couple of bullets in the back of her skull. He has to go to work this evening, and before that he has to get some sleep, so he won't have time to enjoy his slow kill. Later, when he gets home, he can bury her in the meadow, with the 4 dogs watching, insects singing and feeding on one another in the tall grass, and Ariel forced to kiss each of the corpses before it goes forever into the ground. All this in moonlight, if there is any. Quickly now, finish her and sleep.